What survives when everything else is meant to disappear? The question feels abstract until you imagine a single object left behind. A fragment of paper sealed in clay. A strip of film buried in soil. A memory repeated so many times it refuses to fade. History, we like to believe, is a solid record, layered, reliable, patiently waiting for us to read it. But history is fragile. It is written by hands that can also erase. This story begins not with a discovery, but with an absence. With all the things that were supposed to be lost forever. Across centuries, cultures, and continents, there is a quiet pattern that repeats. Moments when knowledge became inconvenient, when truth threatened power, certainty, profit, or identity. In those moments, destruction was not an accident. It was a strategy. Scrolls burned, documents shredded, evidence buried, testimony sealed. The record edited until it no longer challenged the present, and yet something survived. Sometimes it survived by chance. A cave missed by searchers, a box forgotten in an archive. But more often, survival required a choice. A person standing at the edge of fear, deciding whether to obey or to preserve, whether to look away or to hide a copy, whether silence was safer than memory. This is not a story about heroes in the traditional sense. No capes, no speeches. Often, the people who saved these fragments never expected recognition. Some never lived to see the truth emerge. They were librarians, scientists, technicians, witnesses, archivists, ordinary individuals placed in extraordinary tension between authority and conscience. What they understood, sometimes instinctively, was that truth does not defend itself. We tend to imagine suppression as dramatic, loud decrees, public bonfires. But more often, it is quiet. A memo marked confidential. A file misplaced. Access delayed. Years pass, then decades. Eventually, denial hardens into fact, not because it was true, but because no one alive remembers the alternative. This is how knowledge dies in modern times. Not always through violence, but through patience. And yet, here we are, reading, watching, listening, piecing together stories that were never meant to be told. Each surviving fragment is a small defiance of inevitability, a reminder that the historical record we inherit is not complete, not neutral, not guaranteed. The surviving truths we celebrate are exceptions. For every document that escaped, thousands did not. For every testimony preserved, countless voices were silenced. What remains is not the full story. It is what managed to slip through. That realization is unsettling, because it forces a deeper question. If so much could be erased in the past, what might be disappearing now, unnoticed, normalized, justified in the language of necessity? This documentary is not an accusation. It is an exploration. Over the chapters ahead, we will move through deserts and courtrooms, laboratories and archives, memory and silence. We will encounter 10 stories, not of secrets kept, but of secrets that tried to vanish and failed. Each one reveals not only what was hidden, but how fragile our relationship with truth really is. These stories are not connected by ideology or geography. They are connected by a single fragile thread. Someone, somewhere, decided that forgetting was unacceptable. And that decision changed what we are able to know. As we begin, keep this in mind. History is not only written by the powerful, it is also guarded by the quiet. And sometimes the most important acts of preservation happen in darkness, with no guarantee that anyone will ever find what was saved. The question is not why these truths survived. The question is how many did not, and what it means that these few did. It started with a rock thrown in frustration. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd wandering near the cliffs of Qumran, just northwest of the Dead Sea, hurled a stone into a shadowed cave. He heard the sound of pottery breaking. Curious, he climbed inside. What he found would become one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. But only because someone, 2 millennia earlier, had chosen to hide something rather than see it destroyed. Inside that cave were large clay jars wrapped in linen, and inside those jars were scrolls, fragile, flaking, but astonishing. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Some were early versions of biblical texts. Others contained teachings and laws never seen before. They were not copies of what we already knew. They were variations, different tellings, words that had been lost, or more accurately, erased. These scrolls told us something uncomfortable, that religious texts we often imagine as fixed and sacred had once existed in fluid, contested forms. That what is now orthodoxy once had competition, and that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure those alternatives disappeared. But someone else had gone to equal lengths to preserve them. The scrolls were hidden, not lost. Placed deliberately in a cave, wrapped for protection, sealed inside jars. Not scattered, but stored. As if their guardians knew that one day someone might need to find them. And then, for nearly 2,000 years, silence. When scholars began studying the scrolls, they realized just how explosive they were. Not only did they contain the oldest known biblical manuscripts, they included interpretations that diverged from what later became canon. Rules about law, purity, community, accounts of events told differently than we'd ever seen. But the scrolls didn't enter public understanding quickly. For decades, access to the full library was restricted. A small circle of academics controlled what was studied and released. Some parts were published, others were held back. When unauthorized photographs were leaked in the 1990s, they revealed that entire sections had been withheld from public view, not because they were unreadable, but because they were inconvenient. One scroll contradicted a foundational religious story. Another laid out a competing version of moral law. These weren't fringe documents. They were once part of the living, breathing debate within ancient spiritual communities. But those communities had been silenced, their texts destroyed. Except here, in a desert cave, one collection endured. What makes this story more than a historical curiosity is its metaphor. It shows how easily a dominant narrative can be constructed, not by argument, but by erasure. The religious consensus that emerged wasn't inevitable, it was curated, and that curation required suppression. The Dead Sea Scrolls remind us what we think of as ancient truth may have been at one point a victory in an ideological battle. And they also show how narrow the margin of survival can be. One shepherd, one cave, one moment of curiosity. Had that rock landed elsewhere, those jars might still be sitting in silence. Or worse, they might have decayed entirely, their words lost before anyone even knew they existed. We now display the scrolls behind glass, study them in pristine digital archives, treat them as relics. But we should remember, they were nearly lost not to time, but to intention. Someone wanted them gone. And someone else, nameless, forgotten, made sure they weren't. Which leads us to wonder what other libraries were burned before their secrets could be hidden. How many voices were never sealed in clay jars and simply disappeared? In a way, every surviving scroll is a whisper across time, a voice saying, "We were here too." In a locked vault under layers of legal protection and corporate secrecy sat evidence that could have saved lives, but was meant to be buried. It was the 1990s when the documents finally came to light, pried loose by a massive legal case. Internal memos, research reports, emails. They read like fiction, except every word was real. The documents revealed that a major corporation had known for over 4 decades that its products were killing people, and it had done everything in its power to hide that fact. The paper trail began in the 1950s. Scientists working for the company had discovered clear links between their product and fatal diseases. They presented their findings to executives, who responded not with concern but with a chilling strategy. One internal memo, dated 1969, outlined it bluntly: "Doubt is our product." The plan was not to find the truth, but to obscure it, to create confusion, to fund favorable research, question independent studies, and delay regulation. If the public stayed unsure, the profits would continue. But the deception didn't stop there. Other memos discussed how to destroy incriminating files. Some researchers were instructed never to write things down. There were even efforts to misfile or relocate documents so they couldn't be easily found. Over the years, entire archives were quietly purged. Still, a few fragments survived, not because of corporate oversight, but because of people. Some employees, disturbed by what they saw, secretly made copies. Others refused to destroy files. A few documents simply ended up in the wrong filing cabinet and were forgotten until it was too late to erase them. When those documents were made public, the scale of the cover-up stunned even seasoned investigators. The company had knowingly targeted children with advertising, knowing full well the long-term health consequences. They'd even considered making their products less harmful, but decided against it because it would reduce customer dependency. It wasn't just a failure of ethics. It was a calculated decision, lives traded for profits. What gives this story its haunting power is not only what was done, but how close the truth came to vanishing entirely. Had those few employees followed orders, had every document been shredded, the company might still be claiming ignorance. Generations of illness and death would have remained unexplained, unaccounted for. Instead, the truth survived, barely. And it revealed a playbook: the mechanics of manufacturing scientific doubt, a system for buying time, discrediting critics, and manipulating public opinion. That playbook didn't disappear with this case. It's been used again and again in other industries, other products, other harms. But here, in this story, we see the anatomy of deception and the anatomy of survival, not heroic in the traditional sense, but quiet, fearful, necessary. An assistant who kept a memo, a researcher who refused to delete an email. These small acts of defiance became lifelines for truth. We often assume that systems will self-correct, that regulations, journalism, or ethics boards will catch the worst offenses. But this case shows otherwise. The system only worked because a few individuals stepped outside of it. They preserved something when everyone else was told to destroy it. And so we are left with the uncomfortable question: how many other truths have been buried, more successfully, more completely, because no one kept a copy? The documents exposed more than a scandal. They exposed our vulnerability to forgetting, to being told a lie so often, so persuasively, that we stop looking for the paper trail. Unless, by chance or courage, someone leaves a trail behind. The desert wind carried more than dust. It carried silence, enforced, deliberate, deadly. In the early 1970s, a news crew embedded with a military unit captured footage that was never meant to see the light of day. What they recorded during a brutal operation contradicted every official report. It showed civilians, unarmed, fleeing, being gunned down, entire villages reduced to cinders, orders given without hesitation. The kind of evidence that doesn't allow for euphemisms. They filmed everything. But upon returning, military officials demanded the footage. Under the banner of national security, the reels were seized. The network was told the originals had been destroyed. The official reason? Operational risk. In truth, it was something far simpler. This footage proved war crimes. The story might have ended there, buried beneath classification stamps and denials, if not for one man. The cameraman had made a copy. Before turning over the footage, he had secretly duplicated a reel and buried it, literally, wrapped tightly, sealed against the elements, hidden where no one would look, and then he said nothing, for decades. He feared prosecution, reprisal, disgrace, so he waited. All the while, the official record stood firm. No civilians were harmed, no massacres occurred, no wrongdoing could be confirmed. Survivors were dismissed as enemy sympathizers, their stories labeled as exaggerations, or worse, lies. Until the cameraman was dying. He reached out to a journalist with a simple message: "There's something you need to see." What the journalist recovered from that buried canister was harrowing. Grainy, yes, but undeniable. Orders being given to open fire on villagers. Entire families fleeing through fields, only to collapse. Villages engulfed in flames as soldiers watched. When the footage aired, the reaction was immediate and split. The government denied everything. They claimed the video was doctored, taken out of context, even fabricated entirely. But independent analysts authenticated it. Veterans who had served confirmed its accuracy. And most poignantly, survivors, long ignored, were suddenly believed. The footage was real. What makes this story endure is not only its tragedy, but its fragility. The original tapes were destroyed, official records sanitized, denials rehearsed over decades. But had the cameraman chosen obedience over memory, had he handed over that last copy, the evidence would have vanished forever. The truth would have died in silence. Instead, one hidden reel exposed a hidden history. And with it came something even more powerful: vindication. For the villagers labeled liars. For the whistleblowers smeared as traitors. For the families who carried stories no one would print. That moment on film became a touchstone, not only for justice, but for memory. But it nearly didn't happen. It all hinged on a single act of disobedience. One decision made in private: to make a copy and hide it. Because the cameraman understood something essential. There are moments when the official record is a lie, and in those moments truth depends not on systems, but on individuals. We tell ourselves that what is filmed is what is remembered, but footage can be destroyed. Tape can be erased. And when that happens, what remains isn't the absence of evidence, it's the presence of denial. This time, denial lost. But how many cameras were seized? How many stories were buried without backup? How many acts were scrubbed clean from history because no one thought or dared to press record one extra time? This footage didn't just document atrocity. It documented the fragile line between truth and disappearance, and how close that line came to breaking. She knew they would come for her work. In the 1930s, as authoritarianism spread across Europe, science became a target, not for its failure, but for its independence. One regime declared certain theories ideologically incompatible. Researchers were ordered to align with political doctrine. Those who refused were silenced. Their work burned. She was a physicist, young, brilliant, and increasingly afraid. Her research challenged accepted paradigms, exploring questions of matter and motion that didn't align with the regime's imposed worldview. She watched colleagues denounce their own findings. Journals vanished. Entire libraries were cleared, not because the ideas were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. And then her name appeared on a list. She knew what came next. So, quietly, she copied everything. She tore pages from lab notebooks, rewrote data onto onion skin paper, and stitched pages into the lining of her coat. She memorized formulas and repeated them to herself at night. When guards came to confiscate her lab, she handed over the official records, sanitized, incomplete. The rest traveled with her. Her escape was harrowing. At border checkpoints, she smiled and feigned calm, while her coat brushed against guards' hands. She answered questions slowly, buying time. She knew if they found the pages, she wouldn't be arrested. She'd disappear. But somehow she made it out. Once safe in a small apartment across an ocean, she spread the pages across a table and began again, reconstructing what had almost been lost, rewriting what she'd memorized, building the foundation for discoveries that would, years later, change the direction of physics. Her work helped unlock technologies we now take for granted. But the notebooks she used? They still bear creases from being folded inside boots, stains from train compartments, smudges from fear sweat. They are more than scientific records. They are survival. What gives her story its enduring gravity is what happened to those who stayed behind. Their labs were shuttered, their papers incinerated, their ideas, some of them likely as groundbreaking as hers, erased. Not by accident, by design. And we will never know what we lost. We often imagine science as cumulative, a march forward, but it's not immune to erasure. Entire lines of inquiry can be deleted if they threaten the wrong narrative. Progress can be paused or reversed if truth becomes inconvenient. In this case, truth ran, hid, and waited. Her story isn't just about genius. It's about defiance. About a scientist who realized that ideas, like people, need asylum. That knowledge, like memory, can be hunted and must be protected. She didn't save her work because she believed it would win awards. She saved it because she knew what it meant to lose it. Years later, her preserved research would become the cornerstone of breakthroughs. But what gives it weight isn't only what it achieved, it's what it escaped. Each page is a relic of defiance against destruction. And so we ask, how many other revolutions in thought were lost to fear? How many notebooks never crossed the border? This story reminds us, sometimes the most radical act a person can commit is to keep thinking, even when the world tells them not to, even when the cost is everything. The room was quiet, except for the sound of voices trying not to break. In the 1980s, a series of confidential interviews took place behind closed doors. Survivors of a massacre, men, women, children, gave their accounts. They named names. Described soldiers going door to door. Talked about bodies burned to erase the evidence. Every story was recorded. Every word stored. Then the government sealed it all. The testimonies were classified as state secrets. Witnesses were pressured to recant. Some disappeared. The official report, when it was finally released, claimed there was no pattern of abuse, no orchestrated violence, just isolated incidents. The truth had been buried under a veneer of procedural formality. Except one man didn't accept that. He was an investigator, working on the case from the inside. He saw how the testimony was edited. He watched as critical statements, especially those implicating higher-ups, were quietly removed or softened. He heard whispers about which witnesses had been threatened and which had been told their families would suffer if they spoke again. So he made a decision. Without authorization, he began making his own recordings. He'd smuggle in duplicate cassettes and run a hidden recorder during testimony sessions. He stored the tapes in his home, hidden behind bookshelves, labeled under false names. For years, he told no one, not his family, not his colleagues. Then came the fire, a mysterious blaze at the government archive. All official records of the investigation were lost, reduced to ash. No backup, no explanation. The event was dismissed as accidental. But for the investigator, it was confirmation. The truth wasn't just being ignored, it was being hunted. Decades passed. The massacre faded from headlines. Survivors grew older, many never seeing justice. The official version remained. No proof of systematic violence, no evidence of command responsibility, until the tapes emerged. By then, the political climate had shifted. The investigator, now elderly, approached a journalist. When the recordings were verified and broadcast, they broke through the decades of denial. They revealed not only the atrocity, but the cover-up, the full, unedited voices of survivors, their names, their words, their pain, and the pressure they'd face to stay silent. One particularly haunting segment captured a government official mid-threat, telling a witness that her testimony could be seen as treason. Another recorded a session abruptly ended when a survivor began to speak about orders from high command. These weren't just accounts of violence, they were evidence of deliberate suppression. What makes this story so essential is not just that the massacre happened, but that it nearly vanished. The truth wasn't saved by institutions. It was saved by one man's private act of preservation, a decision made not with fanfare, but with fear and resolve. He understood what the silence meant, and he refused to let it stand. Today, those tapes are archived, digitized, studied. They've shaped historical understanding. They've led to renewed investigations. But none of it would have happened without the quiet courage of one man who pressed record, even when it was forbidden. We often imagine truth as resilient, but it's not. It can be smothered in a moment, erased with a match or a memo, unless someone chooses to save it. So we ask, how many stories have vanished because no one did? How many testimonies were silenced without a single recording left behind? The answers we have are only possible because once someone refused to stop listening, and made sure we could hear it too. In a clinical lab, thousands of miles from the headlines, silence was a business decision. The drug was hailed as a breakthrough. Safe, effective, revolutionary. It was marketed globally with glossy ads and glowing endorsements. But behind the scenes, early clinical trials had painted a different picture, one of harm, of serious side effects, even death. That data was never meant to be seen. The trials had taken place in developing countries where regulations were lax and oversight minimal. There, adverse reactions were logged: organ failure, neurological complications, fatalities. Internal memos acknowledged the danger. These results cannot be shared with regulators. One executive wrote, they knew the risk, they chose the profit. And then they buried the truth. Documents were scrubbed. Only the favorable trial results were submitted. Negative outcomes were discarded, mislabeled, or hidden. Regulators received sanitized data. The public saw only curated success. The drug hit the market with no warnings, no disclaimers, just promises. But not everyone forgot. One researcher on the trials, disturbed by what she witnessed, preserved everything: patient logs, adverse event reports, internal emails. She copied them before leaving the company, risking her career, violating contracts, potentially breaking the law. But she couldn't let the evidence disappear. For years, she waited. She watched as the drug spread, as side effects multiplied, as deaths began to occur in wealthier nations where silence was harder to maintain. The company denied any connection. They cited clinical trial data and the very data that had been edited to hide the truth. And then a journalist came calling. The deaths were now too frequent to ignore. Whispers of suppressed trials surfaced. The researcher came forward. Her cache of hidden files laid everything bare: the manipulation, the internal debates, the calculated decision to mislead. One memo estimated that disclosing side effects would cost billions, a price deemed too high for honesty. The fallout was immediate. Investigations launched, the drug was pulled, lawsuits followed, billions were paid in settlements. But none of it could undo the deaths. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the deception, it's how close it came to succeeding. If not for one person's refusal to look away, to let the data be destroyed, the company's version of reality might still stand. This wasn't just about a dangerous drug. It was about a system that rewards concealment, punishes dissent, and depends on forgetfulness. A system that counts on people not looking closely, or not remembering what they saw. And yet memory persisted. The researcher didn't just save data. She saved the possibility of accountability, of correction, of truth. Her story is not an outlier. It is a case study, one in a long line of examples where the cost of truth is borne by individuals, not institutions. So we ask, how many other trials ended in silence? How many buried reports were never copied, never leaked, never remembered? How many products remain on shelves, protected by the absence of evidence? This story ends not with justice, but with survival of the data, of the truth, of the choice to preserve when destruction seemed safer. And in that choice, a question. When faced with the truth that harms, do we bury it, or do we risk everything to carry it forward? She chose the latter. And because of that, the lie did not last. She wrote because she thought no one else would survive. During a genocide that unfolded over the span of months, swift, brutal, systematic, a young woman hid in a cellar, listening to the world outside unravel. Soldiers moved from house to house, families vanished, screams echoed through the night. And in the dim light of her hiding place, she began to write. Her diary was meticulous, names, dates, descriptions of atrocities. She didn't write in abstractions. She recorded what she saw and heard, who gave the orders, how the killings were carried out, which streets were stained with blood. She believed that if she didn't live, maybe the pages would. She hid the diary under floorboards, wrapped in cloth. She moved it as she moved, always watching, always writing. But eventually the hiding place was found. Soldiers stormed in. One of them found the notebook, flipped through it, and laughed. "So you're a writer," he said. He read aloud a passage describing a massacre, one he had likely committed. Then he burned the pages, one by one, in front of her. They thought they had erased her truth, but she had already begun committing it to memory. In detention, waiting for execution, she lay awake every night, repeating the words to herself. She traced the scenes in her mind, recalled the names, reconstructed the timeline. She understood what few do in those final hours. Memory is a form of resistance. Miraculously, she survived. After the regime collapsed and the killing stopped, she found a piece of paper and began to write. Not a diary now, but a reconstruction. From memory, from pain, from the fire that had taken her original manuscript. At first, investigators dismissed it. A second-hand account, unreliable, too emotional. But as they interviewed other survivors, they found her entries matched independent testimony, names aligned, dates confirmed, even minor details. The pattern of uniforms, the routes soldiers took, were accurate. Eventually, her recreated diary became part of the record. It was used in trials, cross-examined, corroborated. It helped convict commanders who claimed they had never issued orders. Her pages showed otherwise. What gives her story such weight is what it nearly became, a silence. Had she not memorized those passages, had she not written them again, the record would have had a hole, and into that hole would have rushed denial. Instead, she held the truth in her mind until it could be written again. We tend to think of memory as fragile, but in this case, memory was stronger than paper. Her diary reminds us that sometimes the written word is not enough. Sometimes it must live inside someone, passed from breath to breath, even in hiding, even in fear. The original pages were ashes, but the story survived because she became its keeper. So we ask, how many stories were told to empty rooms? How many witnesses were silenced before they could write? How many diaries were burned without a chance at rebirth? This story is not just about survival. It's about the will to remember, the defiance of preserving truth not in a vault, but in a human mind. When the time came, she wrote again. And the world, finally, listened. He watched the war approach with a sinking certainty. In the final months before conflict broke out, an intelligence analyst pieced together a report that contradicted everything the public was being told. The government claimed the threat was real, urgent, undeniable. But the analyst's assessment was different, dangerously different. The most alarming claims, he found, had no credible evidence. Sources were weak. Key details had been cherry-picked. Contradictory intelligence was ignored. It was, in his words, a predetermined conclusion in search of justification. He filed the report through official channels. It was immediately classified at the highest level. He was told to revise it, to align with the official line. He refused. And then, quietly, he was transferred. All copies of the report were ordered destroyed. The intelligence community moved on. The march to war continued. But he had kept one, not out of vengeance, out of necessity. Because he'd seen this before. Inconvenient truths buried, dissent erased, history rewritten before it could even be written. He hid the report at home. For years he said nothing. He watched the war unfold, watched as the justifications unraveled, as the promised weapons failed to appear, as the costs mounted in lives and trust. Still, the government insisted. We acted on the best available intelligence. But he knew that wasn't true, and eventually the time came to speak. He leaked the report to a journalist who verified its authenticity and published it. The fallout was immediate. The document was dated. It had been written before the war. It addressed the exact claims used to justify it, and showed they were false. Officials called it biased, outdated, politicized, but the facts stood firm. Investigations followed, confirming the analyst's findings. The weapons didn't exist. The threat was inflated. The war had been justified on a foundation of sand. What makes this story haunting isn't just the deception. It's the erasure. Had that one copy not been saved, the world would have accepted the government's version of events. The false narrative would have become history. Instead, one document rewrote the official story. We often think of whistleblowers as loud, dramatic figures, but sometimes they are quiet, patient, waiting for the moment when truth might finally matter. His act wasn't just one of exposure, it was preservation. He kept a record not just for justice, but for memory, for the chance, however slim, that someone someday would ask, was it really true? And he'd be able to answer. So we ask, how many assessments have been revised into compliance? How many warnings deleted? How many wars marched forward on the backs of silenced analysts? Truth in these moments doesn't disappear in fire. It dissolves in bureaucracy, unless someone chooses to carry it. He did. And because of that, the truth did not vanish, even if it arrived too late to stop what had already begun. Beneath layers of dust and silence, the past waited to speak. In the 1930s, a team of archaeologists began excavating a site chosen by a nationalist regime. The goal wasn't just discovery, it was confirmation. The government wanted proof of an idealized past, a pure culture, an unbroken lineage, a heroic narrative. The dig was meant to serve ideology, not history. At first, things went as planned. Artifacts were uncovered that fit the official story. They were celebrated, photographed, displayed. But then something unexpected emerged, pottery from foreign cultures, trade goods bearing symbols of supposed enemies, inscriptions in multiple languages. These findings told a different story, one of cultural mixing, diversity, and complexity. They showed that the past wasn't pure. It was messy, interconnected, human. That was a problem. The regime ordered the narrative corrected. Certain items were to be removed from records, contradictory artifacts reinterpreted or destroyed. The lead archaeologist was instructed to revise his reports, to reshape history into something usable. He refused. Shortly afterward, he was removed from the project. Official statements claimed the excavation had ended. The museum displays told a clean, simplified version. But before leaving, the archaeologist made a choice. He took what he could. Carefully, secretly, he preserved select artifacts. He hid them in crates mislabeled as personal items, stored them in his home, logged them as destroyed. For decades, he told no one. The regime fell. Time passed, and in his final years, the archaeologist came forward. He unveiled the hidden collection, the clay figures with foreign features, the inscriptions in suppressed scripts, the tools that spoke of trade, not isolation. They rewrote the story of the site. They proved the government's narrative had been fiction. What makes these artifacts so powerful isn't just their content. It's their survival. They are evidence that history, too, can be censored, that what we learn about the past is shaped by the needs of the present, that archaeology can become propaganda and museums instruments of ideology, and that sometimes the only thing standing between truth and oblivion is one person's quiet refusal to comply. His actions were not dramatic. No protest, no publication, just preservation. He understood what was at stake, not just objects, but understanding, not just evidence, but memory. Today, those hidden artifacts are part of the official record. They appear in textbooks, documentaries, museum exhibits, often without mention of how close they came to destruction. So we ask, how many other versions of the past have been rewritten? How many histories sculpted to fit the needs of regimes? How many excavations uncovered the truth only to bury it again? History is not only what is found, it is what is allowed to remain. And in this case, what remained did so because someone chose to protect what didn't fit the story. In doing so, he ensured that the past could speak, not in one voice, but in many. The cameras rolled, the lights were hot, the question was routine. In 1968, a high-ranking government official sat down for what was meant to be a standard television interview. The crew had done dozens of these. The questions were known in advance. But halfway through, the conversation took an unexpected turn. The interviewer asked about covert operations, the kind the government had always denied. And the official, perhaps tired, perhaps too comfortable, answered. He didn't hedge. He didn't speak in euphemisms. He casually confirmed what critics had long suspected. Secret programs, illegal activities, foreign interventions carried out in the shadows. Names, dates, even objectives, all laid bare in a few unguarded minutes. The interviewer, sensing the magnitude, tried to press further, but the official realized his mistake. He backpedaled, changed the subject, smiled nervously, but it was too late. The footage existed. Until it didn't. Within minutes, government agents arrived at the studio. They claimed national security had been compromised. They confiscated the interview tapes. The network was ordered to say nothing. All official recordings were destroyed. But one technician had made a personal copy. He'd recorded the live feed onto a private reel, not out of subversion, but habit. A backup. A memento. He hadn't thought much of it until the agents arrived. And then he realized what he had. For 30 years he kept it hidden. He watched as the government denied everything, as critics were called conspiracy theorists, as the programs that had been casually described in that interview were written off as fiction. And still, he said nothing. He waited until the official who spoke had passed away, until the political climate had changed. Then quietly he reached out to a documentarian and handed over the reel. What the footage revealed was simple, but devastating. It confirmed from the mouth of a trusted insider the existence of covert operations that had shaped global events. And it showed that the denials weren't misunderstandings, they were lies. When the recording aired, the reaction was immediate. Some called it fake. Others said the official had been speaking off the record, but forensic analysis confirmed its authenticity. The truth was undeniable, and suddenly history had to change. What makes this story powerful isn't just the content of the tape, it's how narrowly it survived. Had the technician followed orders, had he erased his backup, that moment would have vanished. Official records would have held firm. The denials would have remained unchallenged. But he didn't. He kept a reel in a drawer, a small act of preservation that outlasted decades of silence. We often think of censorship as overt, books banned, broadcasts interrupted, but often it's invisible. A missing tape, a rewritten transcript, an interview that never happened, unless someone keeps a copy. So we ask, how many mistakes were caught on camera, then erased before anyone could see? How many truths slipped into the ether because no one pressed record, or no one saved what they did? This time the truth survived, because one man, unknown, uncelebrated, chose to save something he wasn't supposed to. And in doing so, he gave us a glimpse behind the curtain, not of drama or scandal, but of how fragile the truth really is when no one is watching the backups. The scrolls, the memos, the footage, the diaries. They weren't supposed to survive. Across centuries and continents, these fragments of truth slip through the cracks of destruction, sometimes by luck, but more often by choice. A shepherd stumbled into a cave. A technician pressed record. A scientist stitched notes into a coat. Each moment small. Each act, in hindsight, enormous. Taken together, they form a pattern. Secrets meant to vanish, preserved by individuals who refused to let silence win. There were 10 stories, each different in detail but identical in tension. Knowledge against erasure, truth against convenience, memory against forgetting. The religious texts hidden in jars told us sacred history was never as unified as we'd been taught. The corporate documents revealed how science can be weaponized, not to illuminate, but to confuse. The buried footage proved that denial can be defeated by one hidden reel, and behind each revelation stood a single person, usually not powerful, often not safe, who chose to act. The common theme was not just suppression, it was intent. In each case, someone had tried to make the truth disappear, not by argument, but by destruction. They almost succeeded. Most of the knowledge they targeted was lost. Most documents were burned. Most witnesses silenced. Most evidence buried. What survived represents not a full account, but a survivor's bias, the rare pieces that escaped. We can only guess what never made it. There is a danger in assuming history is what's been recorded, that what we know is all there is. These stories prove otherwise. They show that official records are often crafted not just by facts, but by what institutions allow to be remembered, and that remembering is sometimes an act of rebellion. What saved these secrets wasn't oversight, it wasn't policy, it wasn't transparency. It was one person in a moment of uncertainty deciding that truth mattered more than obedience, more than safety, sometimes more than survival. A cameraman buried film. A researcher saved raw data. An investigator made secret tapes. Each of them knew what they were risking. Each of them saw that destruction was coming. And each decided to preserve what they could for a future they might never see. We now study these fragments with reverence. We digitize them, exhibit them, cite them in papers. But we must remember what they really are. The accidents of survival, the exception, not the rule. So we ask, what stories were never written down? What tapes were destroyed without backup? What voices spoke the truth once and were never heard again? The silence around these stories is not neutral. It is shaped, cultivated, protected, and only occasionally interrupted. These 10 stories are interruptions. Each one reminds us that truth is not immortal. It can be killed, buried, forgotten, unless someone decides not to let that happen. And that decision, quiet, risky, often thankless, is what keeps memory alive, even now, even here, even still. They called them conspiracy theories. For decades, critics who questioned official stories were dismissed, told they had no evidence, mocked for connecting dots that weren't supposed to be connected. But time and the release of forgotten fragments painted a different picture. A scroll found in a cave altered sacred chronology. A hidden memo revealed decades of corporate deception. A strip of buried film proved war crimes that had been officially denied. These were not myths. They were truths that nearly disappeared, saved by chance, by courage, by the simple act of refusing to forget. In the aftermath of each revelation, there was shock, anger, denial. Institutions scrambled to reframe what had been exposed. Some claimed context had been lost, others questioned authenticity. And yet, each time, the evidence held. What these stories revealed, more than any single atrocity or cover-up, was a playbook. Deny the claim, discredit the source, delay the release, destroy the record, repeat. In some cases, it took decades for the truth to emerge. By then, perpetrators had died, institutions had changed, and public memory had faded. But the consequences remained. Lives lost, histories distorted, justice delayed, and sometimes denied entirely. And yet, even in delay, truth held power. The diary rewritten from memory became a keystone in war crimes trials. The hidden scientific notes paved the way for breakthroughs. The taped testimony revealed not just what had happened, but how it had been hidden. Each artifact, each recording, each copy whispered a quiet resistance. I survived. What binds these stories together is not just their survival, it's their improbability. How narrowly they escaped, how close they came to being destroyed entirely. If one technician had erased a tape, if one scientist hadn't copied her notes, if one analyst hadn't saved a draft, history would be different. We would know less. And we wouldn't even know what we'd lost. We like to believe that truth is self-correcting, that eventually what is hidden will come to light. But these stories remind us that only happens when someone, somewhere, takes a risk, breaks a rule, keeps a copy. And that doesn't always happen. The silence around these 10 stories is louder than the stories themselves. It speaks of all the other truths, the ones erased without resistance, the ones whose witnesses didn't survive, the ones destroyed before they could ever be known. This is what makes the surviving fragments sacred, not because they are perfect, but because they are rare. And so we ask again, what else have we lost? What truths died quietly, with no one there to hold them? And, more urgently, what are we losing now? The suppression of knowledge isn't just a relic of the past. It's a method, a strategy, one still used, often in plain sight. Today, the tools are more sophisticated, digital, invisible, but the aim is the same. Control the record, shape the story, bury the rest. Unless someone refuses, unless someone, somewhere, decides again, this cannot be forgotten. And make sure, somehow, it isn't. The past does not speak unless someone listens. Across these 14 chapters, a simple truth has emerged. What we know of history is shaped as much by what survives as by what is lost. And most of what was ever known is already gone, not vanished by accident, but erased on purpose. Each of the 10 secrets we explored came inches from extinction. They were not preserved by systems built to protect truth. They were saved by individuals who stood at the threshold between silence and memory and chose to act. A shepherd who disturbed ancient jars, a scientist who refused to leave her research behind, a cameraman who buried the only surviving evidence of atrocity, an analyst who saved a report knowing it might never be read. These were not people with power. They were people with conscience. And their stories remind us, truth is not a default condition of the world. It is a fragile inheritance. What makes this realization unsettling and necessary is the pattern it reveals. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger rhythm of concealment and control. Knowledge deemed dangerous is not debated. It is destroyed. Testimonies are classified. Evidence is deleted. History is curated to fit a narrative, one that flatters the present and erases what complicates it. Yet, despite this, some truths survived, not because they were indestructible, but because someone made them so. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, but also unprecedented capacity to alter, delete, or distort it. Files disappear, sources vanish, narratives shift in real time. And it becomes harder to know what was real, or what was almost forgotten. In this landscape, the lessons of these stories matter more than ever. They teach us that the act of remembering is not passive. It is active. It requires vigilance, intention, and often risk. They remind us that documentation is not preservation unless it is protected. That truth, once suppressed, does not scream. It fades, quietly, like paper in firelight. And they show us that history is not a collection of facts, but of decisions. To tell or not tell, to hide or to reveal, to preserve or to let go. So where does that leave us? With a responsibility to question what we're told, to ask what we're not, to preserve what might otherwise be lost. Not because we're certain of its value, but because once destroyed, it cannot be recovered. The future will look back on this moment with the same uncertainty we feel about the past. What will they find? What will they be denied? Which fragments will whisper through the silence, carried forward because someone, somewhere, decided they were worth saving? Perhaps the most haunting insight of all is this: the truth does not survive on its own. It survives because someone carries it, across borders, across decades, across threats, in a notebook, on a reel, in memory. So let us carry it too. Because history is not behind us. It's beneath us, buried, waiting, listening for the sound of someone lifting the stone.